The following program on KROC is sponsored and paid for by Meshbesher and Spence.
And Zach Bauer is here. How are you?
Great.
2 weeks in a row.
Lucky you guys.
Yeah.
That's exactly what I was thinking. What are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about judicial appointments, which is in the news a little bit given the fact that we have brand new judge
around
here in Olmsted County. So Pam King was appointed yesterday by Governor Dayton, and I think she'll be starting hopefully here in the next 6 to 8 weeks. She's a former public defender, works for the trial team for them, and I think Pam will do a nice job. But we'll talk a little bit about how that process kind of works, and I guess if from our standpoint exactly, what that means as far as a lifetime appointment typically.
Sure. Well,
So,
tell us.
Yeah, question I have is, obviously all judges used to be attorneys, I would imagine. I can't think of any examples where that wasn't the case.
Yep, so most, all judges have to basically have a law license.
Okay.
So typically they're attorneys. Some practice in different areas, some, end up going to, maybe the legislature at some point, but they all typically have that background of going to law school and being an attorney. That's a requirement. There's an age requirement as well, and then ultimately there's kind of a retirement requirement, which is mandatory at age 70 typically.
But traditionally, hasn't the appointments generally been prosecutors? Now we're seeing a few more defense lawyers. Is that?
Yeah, I think it kind of varies on who the governor is to some degree.
Okay.
And I think it always, from my perspective, sometimes it doesn't have as much to do necessarily with whether the person's a prosecutor or a defense counsel, but sometimes what their political affiliation can sometimes be. I think that plays a part in it as well. But
It's political. That is
it's amazing,
shocking.
isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, kind of how the process works, though, as people apply, there's kind of layers of which people have to go through before they eventually get to Governor Dayton, and one of those layers is being cut down by kind of a political, not a political group, but a judicial committee that looks at typically candidates between 12 and 15 and tries to narrow that down to 3, and some situations 5, and then that ultimately is handed over to the governor, who makes the ultimate decision on things. But that process, I think, is usually there's lots of input, not only from other attorneys in the area, other judges in the area, to get an idea of, okay, how are these people going to be when they get on the bench? What is their judicial temperament and so forth? And I think overall this governor has done a pretty nice job with that.
Is this something that people campaign for, or are they kind of caught out of the blue? Do you apply for this job, or does somebody just come to you and say, the governor thinks you'd be a great judge?
I don't think it works. It doesn't work that latter
Okay.
way. That would be I think, a nicer situation. But no, it's an application process, so
Okay. people
people apply for it. And then ultimately they kind of get whittled down as the process continues on. There are situations where people can run. It's kind of not as known of a fact here in southeastern Minnesota, because I can't remember the last time when it occurred. But in the Twin Cities area and even in Dakota County, I can recall a situation, because it is it's an appointment, but these people are still elected by the people. That's why, for instance, when you see on the ballot, there'll be judges. Typically,
It's one of the weirdest things.
Typically, they're unopposed, but it's still it's still an office that they have to run for, from the electorate. So it's a situation where if a person decided they wanted to run as a judge, they would certainly have that avenue available to them.
So would that be a situation where, let's say, the governor appoints somebody to be a judge, and then the election comes up and somebody can say, I'd like to challenge that person for that particular seat, and that's how it works, and then they let the people decide. Ultimately.
That's exactly how it works, and typically judges, I think they come up for re-election every 4 years, is my understanding. I may be wrong; it might be 3, but I think it's every 4 years. So.
It always seems like that's part of the ballot that you just go, this is weird, because there's not really a debate. There's, when it's just an odd thing to run for.
And occasionally you might see an ad, but not very often.
Occasionally you see an ad. It is an odd thing to run for, in the sense that I think that generally we like to think of our judges, for instance, Supreme Court justices, which are appointed for a lifetime. We like to think of that as something that is outside of maybe the control of the public, that you don't want it to be too politicized in that sense. But that's not the way it works in Minnesota. So if a person decides that they want to run, whether it be for the Court of Appeals or whether it be for district court judge, that option is available to them, I suppose, if you have enough money to run a campaign.
So the
and
big
if you
question,
don't want to step back in that courtroom again if you lose.
Sure. The big question I have for you is this something you aspire to do one day? Would you ever want to be a judge? I think it would be fun to be a judge.
Yeah, I think there's.
Well, maybe not always fun, but
I don't think it's always.
I just
fun.
love. He's blushing.
I think it's a huge commitment that you make when you do it, and it's obviously something as far as public service, which is a great avenue to go. I think there's a time and place for that for everybody. For me, it's not yet. I'm not gonna say never, but for me, it's not yet. So
I was just about to call Governor Dayton. I'll wait.
You'll wait on that.
We'll wait for a future
We'll start
governor.
the camp. We'll cool the jets on the campaign. That's good.
All right, well, it's very interesting because I guess I just thought they were always appointed. And then I forget. No, you're right. We see that on the ballot.
The thing that I think
sometimes I skip that part because there's
the thing I think is interesting is last week we were talking about that, and that's a mandatory 70 years old you have to retire, and I thought that's kind of funny because 70 doesn't seem like it's that old. It's like what?
And we've had this kind of conversation in a number of different areas of my life recently, but 70. There's 70 as what it used to be 15, 20 years ago,
right?
Yeah.
And now 70 doesn't seem quite as old.
70 is like 90.
Well, 70 is like 50 now.
Exactly.
We're
the other way. 70 is like 50.
90,
Although in talking to like Mark Ostrom, for example, they can use sometimes retired judges for these things like the drug courts or some of the extra things too. So it's not like they are automatically out of the system completely.
It'd
They
just
may
be
have
nice
some
if they
part-time.
could decide. If at 70
that's-
you think, I'd like to keep working, it's too
Right.
bad that I got to retire.
Yeah. All right. Well, Zach, if people want to contact your office, how can they do so?
They can contact us at 507-280-8090 or visit us online at www.meshbesher.com.